roads stopped being repaired in 410 AD. No one noticed at first. A few potholes, some weeds creeping through the stone, nothing alarming. But within a generation, the roads that had connected an empire that had carried armies and trade for 500 years were crumbling into ruin. And with them, everything else collapsed. The coins stopped circulating, the legions stopped patrolling. The aqueducts fell silent, the markets closed, and millions of ordinary people, farmers, bakers, blacksmiths, families who had lived their entire lives under the stability of Rome, woke up one morning to find that the world they knew no longer existed. They had no warning, no preparation, no plan, just the sudden, terrifying realization that they were on their own. This is not the story of emperors or barbarians. This is the story of survival. This is the account of common people who watched the Roman Empire disintegrate around them and had to figure out, day by day, how to stay alive when all the systems they depended on vanished. These are the forgotten voices, the ones who did not write histories or build monuments, but who endured, adapted, and carried human civilization forward through one of the darkest periods in Western history. And their strategies, their choices, their resilience hold lessons we desperately need today. Welcome to English Mindset, where we step into the lives of ordinary people facing extraordinary collapse and discover what it really takes to survive when everything falls apart. Today, we walk through the ruins of the Roman Empire, not as tourists, but as survivors, feeling the fear, the confusion, the desperate ingenuity of people who had to rebuild their world from scratch. If you have ever wondered what happens when the systems you rely on disappear, when the electricity stops, when the supply chains break, when the government fails, then stay with me, because the collapse of Rome is not ancient history. It is a mirror, and it is showing us our future. The fall of the Western Roman Empire was not a single event. It was a slow, grinding collapse that took over a century. Barbarian invasions, economic decay, political instability, plague, all of it compounded until the empire simply could not hold together anymore. In 410 AD, Visigoths sacked Rome itself, the first time the Eternal City had fallen to a foreign enemy in 800 years. In 476 AD, the last Roman emperor in the West was deposed. And across Europe, from Britain to North Africa, the infrastructure, the trade networks, the legal systems, the security that Rome had provided, all of it crumbled. For the common people, this meant chaos. Cities that had been supplied by grain ships from Egypt suddenly faced starvation when those ships stopped coming. Villagers who had sold their crops in urban markets found no buyers. Craftsmen who depended on imported materials could no longer get them. Money became worthless because there was nothing to buy. And without the legions to maintain order, bandits, warlords, and invading tribes moved freely, taking what they wanted, burning what they could not carry. In a village in what is now France, a farmer named Gaius watched his world fall apart. He was 50 years old, a Roman citizen, a man who had paid his taxes, followed the laws, and believed that Rome would last forever. His grandfather had told him stories of the empire's glory, of roads that stretched to the ends of the earth, of peace enforced by the legions. But now the legions were gone. The tax collectors had stopped coming. The roads were impassable. And Gaius stood in his field, holding a plow that he could not replace, looking at crops he could not sell, wondering how he was going to feed his family through the winter. Gaius made a decision that would define the rest of his life. He stopped thinking like a Roman citizen and started thinking like a survivor. He stopped growing grain for the market and started growing food for his family. He stopped relying on imported tools and started making his own. He stopped trusting in the empire and started trusting in his neighbors. And slowly, painfully, he and the people around him built a new way of life, not as grand as Rome, not as secure, but functional, sustainable, and theirs. This shift from a market economy to subsistence living happened across the former empire. People who had been specialists, bakers, potters, weavers, had to become generalists. They had to learn how to grow food, make tools, build shelters, defend themselves. Skills that had been passed down for generations were suddenly worthless. New skills had to be learned, often from scratch, and the people who adapted fastest were the ones who survived. If you are feeling the weight of this collapse, if you are starting to see parallels to our own fragile systems, then let me ask you to do something. If this story is making you think, if it is making you question what happens when the structures we rely on fail, hit the like button. And if you want to keep exploring the moments in history that reveal what we are truly capable of, subscribe to English Mindset and turn on notifications, because we are just beginning to uncover what survival really looks like. One of the first things people had to relearn was how to defend themselves. Under Rome, security had been outsourced to the legions, but when the legions left, villagers were on their own. Bandit gangs roamed the countryside. Invading tribes took what they wanted, and there was no one to call for help. So communities organized militias. Farmers picked up weapons. They built palisades around their villages. They posted sentries. They learned to fight, not as soldiers, but as desperate people protecting their homes. In a village in Britain, a blacksmith named Marcus led the defense when a group of Saxon raiders attacked. Marcus had never been a warrior. He had spent his life making horseshoes and plows. But when the raiders came, he grabbed a hammer, rallied his neighbors, and they fought. It was brutal, it was chaotic, but they drove the raiders off. And from that day forward, Marcus was no longer just a blacksmith. He was a leader, a protector, a man who had stepped into a role he never wanted because survival demanded it. This pattern repeated across the former empire. Leadership became localized. The strong, the clever, the brave, they rose to positions of authority not because of titles or bloodlines, but because they could keep people alive. And this, in many ways, was the birth of feudalism, the system that would define medieval Europe for the next 1,000 years. It was not planned. It was not designed. It emerged organically from the ruins of Rome, as people clustered around anyone who could offer protection, food, and stability. Another survival strategy was retreat. Many people abandoned the cities, which had become death traps. Without functioning aqueducts, clean water was scarce. Without regular food shipments, starvation was common. Without sanitation systems, disease spread rapidly. Urban populations collapsed. People fled to the countryside, to small farms, to fortified villas, anywhere that offered a chance of self-sufficiency. In Rome itself, the population dropped from over 1 million at the height of the empire to less than 20,000 by the 6th century. The great city became a shadow, its forums empty, its aqueducts dry, its temples abandoned. Those who remained lived in the ruins, scavenging marble from ancient buildings to build crude shelters, growing vegetables in what had once been imperial palaces. It was a humiliating, heartbreaking decline, but it was survival. Let me ask you something. If the city you live in collapsed tomorrow, if the water stopped, if the food stopped, if the power stopped, would you stay or would you leave? And if you left, where would you go? What skills would you rely on? Drop a comment and tell me, because I want to know. What do you think it takes to make that choice? One of the most important survival skills was food preservation. Without trade, people could not rely on imports. They had to grow their own food and preserve it for the winter. Salting, smoking, drying, fermenting, these ancient techniques became essential again. People built root cellars to store vegetables. They raised livestock not just for meat, but for milk, cheese, and eggs, foods that could be produced year-round. They foraged for wild plants, nuts, and berries. They hunted and fished. and they learned to waste nothing. In a village in what is now Italy, a woman named Julia became known for her ability to preserve food. She knew which mushrooms were safe, which plants could be dried and stored, which meats could be salted and kept for months. She taught the younger women in the village, passing down knowledge that her grandmother had taught her. And because of Julia, her village survived winters that killed others. She was not a leader in the traditional sense. She held no title, but she was indispensable, and that gave her power, respect, and security. This elevation of practical knowledge over formal education was another hallmark of the post-Roman world. Literacy declined. Latin, once the universal language of administration and culture, fragmented into regional dialects that would eventually become French, Italian, Spanish. Books were rare and precious, but the knowledge of how to survive, how to plant, how to build, how to heal, that knowledge was priceless. And the people who possessed it became the new elites. There was also the role of the church. As the Roman state collapsed, the Christian church became the only institution that survived relatively intact. Monasteries became centers of stability, preserving not just religious texts, but also practical knowledge about agriculture, medicine, and literacy. Monks copied manuscripts, maintained libraries, and ran hospitals. Bishops often became the de facto leaders of cities, organizing food distribution, negotiating with barbarian kings, and maintaining some semblance of order. For common people, the church offered something Rome no longer could: hope. The empire had promised security in this life. The church promised salvation in the next. And when this life became unbearable, when the violence, the hunger, the fear became too much, that promise of something better kept people going. It gave them a reason to endure. It gave them a framework to make sense of suffering. And it gave them a community, a network of mutual support that transcended the collapse of political structures. But not everyone turned to the church. Some turned to the old ways, to pagan gods, to local spirits, to folk magic. The collapse of Rome created a religious vacuum, and different communities filled it in different ways. In rural areas, far from bishops and monasteries, old beliefs persisted. People made offerings to forest gods, consulted wise women for healing, and practiced rituals that had nothing to do with Christianity. It was syncretism, a blending of old and new, and it reflected the chaotic, fragmented nature of post-Roman society. In a village in what is now Germany, a healer named Hilda practiced medicine that combined Christian prayers with herbal remedies and charms that predated Rome itself. She was respected, feared, and needed. When people were sick, they came to her. When crops failed, they asked for her blessing. And when the local priest condemned her practices as witchcraft, the villagers defended her, because she kept them alive. And survival, in the end, mattered more than doctrine. This tension between survival and morality is one of the most haunting aspects of the collapse. People did things they would never have done under Rome. They stole. They lied. They abandoned the weak. They made alliances with enemies. They betrayed friends. Not because they were evil, but because the old rules no longer applied. The collapse forced people to make choices that would have been unthinkable in stable times. And those choices left scars, guilt, trauma that echoed through generations. Let me tell you about a man named Lucius, a Roman administrator who lived in what is now Spain. When the Visigoths took control of his region, Lucius had a choice. He could resist, cling to his Roman identity, and likely be killed. Or he could adapt, learn the Gothic language, serve the new rulers, and survive. He chose survival. He became a scribe for the Gothic king, translating documents, negotiating treaties, using his skills to make himself useful. He betrayed no one directly, but he also stopped being Roman. And for the rest of his life, he wondered if he had made the right choice. Lucius's story is a reminder that survival is not always heroic. Sometimes it is just compromise. Sometimes it is bending, adapting, becoming something you never wanted to be. And that too is part of the human experience. Children growing up in the post-Roman world had no memory of the empire. They were born into chaos, and chaos was all they knew. But they adapted faster than their parents. They learned new languages. They absorbed new customs. They built new identities. And in many ways, they were the bridge between the Roman world and the medieval world, carrying fragments of the old into the new. In a village in what is now England, a boy named Elred grew up speaking both Latin and Anglo-Saxon. His father had been a Roman soldier. His mother was a Briton. Elred learned to read from a monk, to hunt from his grandfather, and to fight from a Saxon warrior who had settled nearby. He was a hybrid, a product of collapse and synthesis, and he represented the future, a world where Roman, Celtic, and Germanic cultures would blend into something new. This cultural blending, this fusion of identities, was one of the unexpected outcomes of the collapse. Rome had tried to impose a single culture, a single language, a single identity. But when Rome fell, diversity exploded. Regional identities emerged, local languages flourished, and out of that chaos, the nations of modern Europe began to take shape. If you are still with me, if these stories are making you think about resilience, about adaptation, about what happens when everything you know disappears, then let me ask you one more time. What do you think kept these people going? Was it faith? Was it family? Was it sheer stubbornness? Tell me in the comments, because I genuinely want to know. One of the most important survival strategies was trade, but not the kind of trade Rome had facilitated. Without coins, people bartered. A farmer traded grain for tools. A blacksmith traded horseshoes for meat. A weaver traded cloth for pottery. It was inefficient, localized, and small scale. But it worked. And slowly, very slowly, new trade networks began to form, centered not around imperial cities, but around monasteries, markets, and river crossings. In a town in what is now France, a merchant named Thierry became wealthy by trading salt, one of the few goods that was always in demand. He traveled dangerous roads, negotiated with bandits, and built relationships with dozens of small communities. He was not rich in the Roman sense, but he had influence, connections, and security. And in the post-Roman world, that was everything. Another key to survival was innovation. Without access to Roman technology, people had to improvise. They built watermills to grind grain. They developed new farming techniques to increase yields. They bred hardier livestock. They learned to smelt iron from local ore. They adapted Roman engineering principles to fit smaller, simpler projects, and in doing so, they laid the groundwork for the technological advances of the Middle Ages. But not all innovation was technological. Some of it was social. Communities experimented with new forms of governance, new ways of resolving disputes, new systems of mutual aid. In some places, assemblies of free men made decisions collectively. In others, a single lord ruled absolutely. There was no single model. Every community found its own way. And that diversity, that experimentation, was itself a form of resilience. The collapse of Rome also created opportunities. For some, the end of the empire meant freedom. Slaves fled their masters. Peasants escaped oppressive landlords. Women, no longer bound by Roman law, found new roles, new autonomy. It was not universal. It was not always positive. But collapse, paradoxically, opened doors that had been closed under the rigid structures of Rome. In a village in what is now Switzerland, a woman named Gisela inherited her husband's farm when he died. Under Roman law, she would have needed a male guardian. But in the chaos of the post-Roman world, no one enforced those rules. Gisela ran the farm herself, made her own decisions, and became one of the most respected figures in her community. She was not free in the modern sense, but she had agency, power, and respect that would have been impossible under the empire. Gisela's story raises a question. Is collapse always bad? Or does it sometimes create space for change, for growth, for people who were marginalized under the old system? It is an uncomfortable question, but it is worth asking. Let me bring this into the present, because the parallels are impossible to ignore. We live in a world of globalized trade, centralized systems, and complex interdependencies. We depend on supply chains we do not control, infrastructure we do not maintain, institutions we do not fully understand. And when those systems fail, as they did in Rome, we will face the same choices. Do we adapt? Do we retreat? Do we innovate? Do we cooperate or compete? The people of the post-Roman world did not have a manual. They figured it out as they went, and so will we. The lessons from the collapse of Rome are clear. Localize your resources, build community, learn practical skills. Do not rely on systems you cannot control. Adapt quickly. Be willing to let go of the old and embrace the new. And above all, do not wait for someone to save you, because when the collapse comes, you are on your own. If this story has moved you, if it has made you think about resilience, about survival, about what it takes to endure when everything falls apart, then I need you to share this video. Not because it helps the algorithm, though it does, but because these lessons matter. These stories matter. And the more people who understand them, the better prepared we will be. Let me end with one final story. There was a farmer, name unknown, who lived in what is now northern Italy. When Rome fell, he did not panic. He did not flee. He simply kept planting. Year after year, while empires rose and fell, while armies marched and cities burned, he planted his crops, harvested his grain, and fed his family. He was not a hero. He was not a leader. But he survived. And his descendants are still there, farming the same land 15 centuries later. That is the ultimate victory, not glory, not power, just continuation. Just the stubborn refusal to give up. Thank you for walking through this history with me. Thank you for honoring these voices. If this video gave you something, hit the like button. If you want to keep exploring the truths that history reveals, subscribe to English Mindset and turn on notifications. Because we are building something here, a space where the past teaches us how to face the future. I will see you in the next story.